This is Pete Walker, and I've been asked to share thoughts on the decision just made by the U.S. to apply 100% tariffs to EVs coming in from China. And the question is, why now? And the other question is, what are the implications going forward for China and for the U.S.? So let me start with a little bit of history, because I think it's important to understand the unique role that the auto industry has played in the history of the U.S. The auto industry is really started in the U.S. by Henry Ford in the early 1900s. So the U.S. has always thought of its auto industry as the backbone of its industrial capabilities. And you're now looking at a rapid turnover of the auto industry from the combustion engine to electric vehicles. This is a very hot election issue. So if you go back to when Trump first put tariffs on China, Biden's response, which actually was totally true, but he's since changed his tune, is that tariffs are nothing more than a tax on consumer, because in the end, all it does is raise price, and that price increase is borne by consumers. So what Biden did really was retain the tariffs that were put in place by Trump, and then he added another whole dimension to the issue, which was blocking China from getting access to high-end advanced technologies from the U.S., especially in areas related to chips. So the why now is we're in the middle of a very heated election in the U.S., and so I think you're seeing China as a front and center issue. EVs are a front and center issue because everyone now realized that China has become the dominant EV producer globally. To protect the U.S. auto industry, tariffs are put in place basically for that reason. Longer term, it's not going to be effective at the end of the day, but people in the political world don't think longer term. I think the deeper question that needs to be put on the table is, how does the U.S. think about what China is doing? And if you read the press over time, the U.S. basically has taken the position that China is subsidizing many industries, especially the EV industry. And by subsidizing, I think most of us would interpret that as an ongoing subsidy that basically means they're not able to sell their product and recover their full cost. That's not the reality of what has happened in China. What has happened in China is the same model that has happened in major corporations around the world. They look at the future, they think of where the opportunities are and what their relative strategic position is going to be. They invest in R&D and in talent and in partnerships to be able to bring that vision to fruition. The big difference that is never talked about in the U.S. is China has basically invested in getting to this position, and China doesn't need to invest anymore in the EV industry because the industry is growing very rapidly and becoming totally self-sufficient. We've taken a strong position that over time we need to become much more environmentally sensitive, and therefore EVs were a clear target. And so admitting at this point in time that China, which had no auto industry to speak of, if you go back about 15 years ago, has now, by being smart and competent, catapulted to the number one position in the autos of tomorrow, which are basically EVs. So the U.S., I think, first and foremost needs to kind of swallow its pride and say, what can we learn from what the Chinese have done, and how do we become competitive? That's not going to be easy. So where does China go from here? First of all, I think China is clearly aware that their product is the best product that's out there, and they're able to produce it at a very attractive price from a strategic point of view. The U.S. is a huge auto market, and I'm sure China resents the idea that China is basically going to be cut out of that market. But the reality is, if you look at where the growth of the auto market is, it's largely in developing countries, and where the population continues to grow at a rapid clip, where the population is relatively younger. So China, I think, has enormous opportunities going forward. They also have the ability for those countries that want to protect their auto industry jobs. China could clearly, as other companies have done, set up manufacturing facilities locally to ensure local employment. So China's position going forward, while it's, I'm sure, disappointing to have the huge U.S. market being carved out, China has more than enough opportunities and a great deal of momentum in terms of the technological advantages that they already have and the brand recognition that they're very rapidly building. So the next question is, where does the U.S. go from here? You know, the core challenge the U.S. faces is that it has adopted a containment strategy towards China, which essentially is we can block their access to U.S. high-end technology and slow them down. The problem is it's very difficult to both contain and compete because it's a very different mindset. So what the U.S. needs to do is to recognize that containment is not going to be possible. You know, as an example, China has more STEM students. Advanced technologies are developed and driven by STEM students. The U.S. has trailed in this area. So what the U.S., I think, has to do is first and foremost make the mindset change that I suggested, which is compete, not contain. So another challenge for the U.S. is to get over the old taboo of industrial policies are unfair and decide how to apply them effectively in America so we can build areas of sustainable competitive advantage. I think China has a large running head start, not only in EVs, but more importantly in the batteries themselves that are basically the engine of the EVs. And catching them is going to be very difficult. But putting tariffs and preventing U.S. consumers from getting access to Chinese vehicles is not going to do anything for our competitive position globally. And so China is going to continue to dominate the production of EVs right now. China also, I'm sure, has a very well thought out program of charging stations, how many you need, where they are, how it impacts the way highways are designed, etc. And the U.S., having gone through a wave where EVs became very popular, is quickly discovering that we don't have an electric grid that can handle all of the charging if everybody shifted to that mode of transportation. So the U.S. has got a lot to do, but it's going to require a well thought out, centralized approach and not one that's going to get ripped apart by bipartisan politics, which has been a problem for a number of years now. So I think history will look back on this stage where the U.S. imposed tariffs and say, you know, that was an interesting first response. It's not going to have much long-term impact, and the long-term impact is going to be determined by who sets out to play in the EV world and makes the kind of investments in talent and innovation and partnerships that are required to be successful.